Meet Edward Godfrey Jr., a seasoned cavalryman and one of the few surviving officers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, who witnessed the Battle of Little Bighorn with his own eyes. His harrowing account of that fateful day has become a crucial piece of the historical puzzle, shedding light on the triumphs and tragedies of Custer's last stand. In our last episode, we delved into Godfrey's eyewitness testimony, and today, we're going to dig even deeper, exploring new aspects of the battle. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. General Custer received written instructions, dated June 22, 1876, at the mouth of Rosebud River, Montana Territory, which read, Lieutenant Colonel Custer, 7th Cavalry, the Brigadier-General Commanding directs that, upon readiness of your regiment, you shall proceed up the Rosebud in pursuit of the Indians whose trail was discovered by Major Reno a few days prior. As it is impossible to provide definitive instructions for this movement, and even if it were possible, the department commander has utmost confidence in your zeal, energy, and ability, and thus does not wish to impose precise orders that might hinder your actions when nearing the enemy. He shall, however, convey his views on your intended course of action and desires that you conform to them unless you deem it necessary to depart from them. He suggests that you proceed up the Rosebud until you ascertain the direction of the aforementioned trail. Should it lead towards the Little Horn, as appears likely, he recommends that you continue southward, possibly as far as the headwaters of the Tongue, then turn towards the Little Horn, constantly feeling to your left to prevent the Indians' escape to the south or southeast by passing around your left flank. Colonel Gibbon's column is presently en route to the mouth of the Bighorn. Upon reaching that point, it will cross the Yellowstone and advance up to at least the forks of the Big and Little Horns. Naturally, its future movements will be dictated by circumstances as they arise, but it is hoped that the Indians, if located on the Little Horn, will be nearly encircled by the two columns, rendering their escape impossible. The department commander requests that, en route up the Rosebud, you thoroughly examine the upper part of Tullock's Creek and attempt to dispatch a scout to Colonel Gibbon's column with information regarding your findings. The lower part of the creek will be examined by a detachment from Colonel Gibbon's command. The supply steamer will be navigated up the Bighorn as far as the forks, if the river permits. The department commander, who will accompany Colonel Gibbon's column, desires that you report to him there no later than the expiration of your troops' rations, unless you receive further orders in the interim. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, E.W. Smith, Captain, 18th Infantry, Acting Assistant Adjutant General. The instructions provided to General Custer were explicit and accurately pinpointed the location of the Indians. Certain writers have assumed that General Terry's command would arrive at the mouth of the Little Bighorn on June 26th, and that General Custer was aware of this plan. Additionally, some have assumed that the two commands were scheduled to converge on that date at that location. However, General Terry's instructions did not specify when his command would reach that point, and according to the instructions, General Custer was not expected to arrive before July 5th or 6th, as his troops were rationed for 15 days. At noon on June 22nd, the forward command was sounded, and the regiment marched out of camp in column of fours, each troop followed by its pack mules. Generals Terry, Gibbon, and Custer reviewed the regiment, stationed near the line of march. General Terry offered a pleasant word to each officer as he returned their salute. The pack trains proved troublesome at the outset, with cargoes falling off before leaving camp, and the mules straggling badly throughout the day. However, after Lieutenant Matthey took charge of the pack trains, their efficiency improved significantly, and they remained well organized after encountering the Indian Trail. The regiment encamped at 4 p.m., having marched 12 miles. At sunset, officers' call was sounded, and the officers assembled at General Custer's bivouac, squatting in groups around his bed. The gathering was somber, with little conversation and a serious mood prevailing. General Custer addressed the officers, stating that trumpet calls would only be sounded in emergencies, and that marches would commence at 5 a.m. sharp. He emphasized that troop commanders were experienced officers, capable of managing their troops, and that only two aspects would be regulated from his headquarters: the timing of departing and arriving at camp. All other details, such as reveille, stables, watering, halting, grazing, etc., would be left to the discretion and judgment of the troop commanders. He stressed the importance of maintaining supporting distance, not advancing ahead of the scouts, and not falling far behind the column. General Custer expressed his reliance on the officers' judgment, discretion, and loyalty, estimating that they might encounter at least 1,000 warriors, potentially supplemented by young men from the agencies, totaling 1,500. General Custer had consulted reports from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and officials in Washington to estimate the number of hostiles, Indians who refused to enroll in agencies. He was confident, based on these reports, that the opposing force would not exceed 1,500. General Terry had offered additional troops from the 2nd Cavalry, but Custer declined, believing the 7th Cavalry could defeat any force that might combine against them. He also declined the offer of Gatling guns, fearing they might hinder their movements due to inferior horses and challenging terrain. The regiment would march 25 to 30 miles daily, and officers were cautioned to conserve rations and the strength of their horses and mules, as they might be out for an extended period. Custer's address to his officers was unusual, as he typically did not share his thoughts so openly. He showed a willingness to listen to suggestions and relied on his officers, which was uncharacteristic. His manner was conciliating and subdued, with a hint of appeal, leaving a deep impression on those present. As the officers dispersed, Lieutenants McIntosh, Wallace, and Godfrey walked to their bivouac in silence before Wallace remarked, "Godfrey, I believe General Custer is going to be killed." Godfrey asked why Wallace thought so, and Wallace replied, "Because I have never heard Custer talk in that way before. I attended to my troops' preparations, issuing orders for the silent reveille and mourning details. I also provided instructions in case of a night attack. The stable guard, packers, and cooks were to immediately calm and guard the horses and mules, while the other men were to gather at a designated rendezvous and await orders. No one was to fire without an officer's command. I then inspected the herd to ensure the animal security. While doing so, I came upon the Indian Scouts' bivouac, where Mitch Bouillet, Bloody Knife, Half Yellow Face, and others were conversing. Bouillet asked if I had fought against the Sioux before, and I replied affirmatively. He inquired about the expected number of Sioux, and I estimated between 1,000 and 1,500. Bouillet asked if I thought we could defeat them, and I confidently replied, "Oh, yes, I guess so." After interpreting our conversation, Bouillet emphasized, "Well, I can tell you we are going to have a damned big fight." At 5 a.m. on June 23rd, General Custer mounted and began the march up the Rosebud, accompanied by 2 sergeants carrying the regimental standard and his personal flag. This signaled the command to mount and follow. 8 miles in, we encountered the first Indian camping site, indicating a large village. We found numerous wickiups, bush shelters, and assumed they were for dogs, but later discovered they were temporary shelters for agency transients. We passed through 3 camping sites, making halts at each, and everyone was engaged in studying the age of pony droppings, tracks, and lodge trails to estimate the number of lodges. These topics dominated our conversations. We encamped at 5 p.m., having marched 33 miles. On June 24th, we encountered numerous camping sites, all appearing to be of similar strength. We assumed these were successive camps of the same village, but in reality, they were continuous camps of various bands. The fact that they seemed to be of the same age did not strike us as significant at the time. We passed through a larger camp, where the grass had been grazed by large herds, and found the frame of a Sundance lodge with a white man's scalp inside. This was where Indians from the agencies had joined the hostiles. The command halted, and the officers assembled, learning that our Crow scouts had discovered fresh signs, including pony tracks and an Indian on foot. As we prepared to separate, General Custer's headquarters flag was blown down by a southerly breeze, falling toward our rear. I picked it up and replanted the staff, but it fell again. I then secured it with a sagebrush. This incident seemed insignificant at the time, but later, Lieutenant Wallace mentioned it as a bad omen, foretelling our defeat. The day's march was tedious, with many long halts to allow the scouts to work ahead. We marched on separate trails to minimize dust clouds, and the valley showed signs of immense pony herds. Signal smokes were reported, but not confirmed. We camped under a bluff at sundown, hiding the command as much as possible, having marched 28 miles. Fires were extinguished after supper, and we prepared to march again at 11:30 p.m. Lieutenant Hare and I retired around 9:30 p.m. to take a brief nap. However, our rest was soon interrupted by a voice saying, "He's over there by that tree," which accurately described my location. I inquired about the purpose of the summons and was told that General Custer requested the presence of all officers at headquarters immediately. We abandoned our much-needed rest and navigated through horse herds, sleeping men, and thickets to find headquarters, guided only by a solitary candlelight. Upon arrival, General Custer informed us that the trail led to the Little Bighorn, and we would march immediately to conceal ourselves near the divide before daylight. This would allow time to study the terrain, locate the village, and plan the attack for the 26th. We returned to our troops, except for Lieutenant Hare, who joined the scouts. The night march was challenging due to dust and noise, making it difficult to see or hear. We relied on following the dust cloud and occasional whistling or hallooing to guide us. Eventually, troopers were sent ahead to listen for sounds from the scouts. At 2 a.m. on June 25th, we halted to await further news from the scouts, having marched about 10 miles. Some troops unsaddled to rest their horses, and later, coffee was made, though it was undrinkable due to the alkaline water. Before 8 a.m., General Custer rode bareback to each troop, giving orders to prepare for the march and sharing information from the scouts about the location of the Indian villages. Just before departing, I observed General Custer engaged in a serious conversation with Bloody Knife, Scouts, and an interpreter. The scouts appeared nervous, and Bloody Knife mentioned that we would find enough Sioux to fight for 2 or 3 days. General Custer smiled, remarking, "I guess we'll get through with them in one day." We commenced our march at 8 a.m. and continued uninterrupted until 10:30 a.m., when we halted in a ravine and were instructed to maintain silence, conceal ourselves, and avoid any actions that might reveal our presence to the enemy. We had marched approximately 10 miles. In Indian warfare, it is a rare occurrence for a commander to have the opportunity to reconnoiter the enemy's position in daylight, especially if the Indians are aware of the troops' presence in the area. When following an Indian trail, the signs indicate the elapsed time since the Indians' presence. If the signs indicate a hot trail, the commander judges their distance and attempts to reach the Indian village by night, making dispositions for a surprise attack at dawn. The attack must be made swiftly, often without knowledge of the opposing forces' numbers beyond what is discovered or conjectured while following the trail. The dispositions for the attack are made in the dark, and successful surprise relies on luck. If the advance is made in daylight, it is nearly impossible to approach without being discovered. In our previous experiences, once the Indians knew of our presence, they would swarm to attack, employing ruses to mislead us, delay our advance, and allow their squaws and children to escape with their belongings and pony herd, making pursuit difficult. In contrast, civilized warfare allows hostile forces to confront each other for extended periods, and battles can be conducted with a reasonable understanding of each other's numbers and positions. A full knowledge of the enemy's presence does not necessarily imply an immediate attack. In Indian warfare, the rule is touch and go, and its unpredictable nature is often misunderstood by those familiar only with civilized warfare. It was well known to the Indians that the troops were in the field, and a battle was fully expected by them. However, the close proximity of our column was not known to them until the morning of the day of the battle. Several young men had left the hostile camp that morning to visit an agency in Nebraska. They saw the dust raised by our troops and returned to the village, warning that the troops were approaching. Thus, the attack was not a surprise. The Indian camp had been pitched at the site of the attack for 2 or 3 days. The location was not chosen with the intention of making it the battlefield, but rather as a convenient spot to camp. The Indians typically camped by bands, with each band spaced apart, occupying a territory of several miles along the river valley. However, in anticipation of fulfilling Sitting Bull's prophecy, the village had massed together. The Little Bighorn River, or Greasy Grass to the Indians, is a rapid, winding mountain stream, 20 to 40 yards wide, with a pebbled bottom and abrupt, soft banks. The water is typically 2 to 5 feet deep, depending on the width of the channel. The river flows northeasterly to the Little Bighorn battlefields, then trends northwesterly to its confluence with the Bighorn River. The surrounding topography includes an undulating prairie plateau between the Little Bighorn and Bighorn rivers, and the Little Chetish or Wolf Mountains between the Little Bighorn and Rosebud Rivers. This mountainous region is characterized by rough, broken terrain, high precipitous hills, and deep, narrow gulches, rather than a rocky upheaval or mountain chain. The command had followed the trail up a branch of the Rosebud, nearing the summit of the mountains, forming the divide. To our right lay the divide between the Little Bighorn and Tullock's Fork. The creek draining the watershed to our right and front is known as Sundance, Benteen's, or Reno's Creek. The trail, winding and treacherous, followed the bed and valley of the south branch of this creek, which was dry for most of its length. From the divide between the Little Bighorn and Rosebud, the scouts had spotted smoke rising above the village and pony herds grazing in the Little Bighorn Valley, approximately 12 to 15 miles away. General Custer had gone to this point of view while the column halted in the ravine. Due to the high bluffs screening the village, it was impossible to discover more of the enemy than already reported by the scouts. Our officers gathered in groups, discussing the situation, while others sought solitude, sleep, or meditation. The Re-Scouts, who had been inactive for some time, were anointed and invoked the Great Spirit's protection by their medicine man. They seemed convinced that we would encounter more Sioux than we could handle. Captain Yates' troop had lost a pack of hard bread during the night march, and a detail was sent back to recover it. Captain Keogh reported that the detail had returned, and Sergeant Curtis described finding an Indian opening a box of hard bread with his tomahawk. The Indian fled upon seeing the soldiers. This information was promptly taken to General Custer, who sounded officer's call. The general recounted Captain Keogh's report and mentioned that scouts had seen Indians observing our movements along the ridge overlooking the valley. He believed our presence had been discovered, making further concealment unnecessary. He decided to attack the village immediately, rather than waiting until the next morning, to prevent the village from scattering and escaping. Troop commanders were ordered to detail 1 non-commissioned officer and 6 men to accompany the pack, inspect their troops, and report readiness. The troops would take their places in the column of march and the order reports were received, with the last one to report escorting the pack train. The inspections were swiftly completed, and the column set out once more. We crossed the dividing ridge between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn valleys shortly before noon. Soon after, the regiment was divided into battalions. Major Reno's advance battalion comprised Troop M, led by Captain French, Troop A, under Captain Moylan and Lieutenant DeRudio, Troop G, led by Lieutenants McIntosh and Wallace. The Indian Scouts, guided by Lieutenants Varnum and Hare and Interpreter Gerard. Lieutenant Hodgson served as acting adjutant, and Doctors Dywolf and Porter attended to medical duties. Captain Benteen's battalion comprised Troop H, led by Captain Benteen and Lieutenant Gibson, Troop D, under Captain Weir and Lieutenant Edgerly, and Troop K, led by Lieutenant Godfrey. The pack train, under Lieutenant Matthey's charge, was escorted by Troop B, led by Captain McDougall. Major Reno's battalion marched down a valley that developed into the south branch of the small tributary to the Little Bighorn, now known as Sundance, Benteen's, or Reno Creek. The Indian Trail followed the meanderings of this valley. Custer's column trailed Reno's closely, bearing to the right and rear, while the pack train followed their trail. Captain Benteen's battalion was ordered to the left and front, towards a line of high bluffs approximately 3 or 4 miles distant. Benteen was instructed to send word to Custer if he encountered anything, and to engage any enemy he came across. If he reached the high bluffs without sighting the enemy, he was to continue his march to the next line of bluffs, and so on, until he could see the Little Bighorn Valley. It is evident that General Custer believed the Indians would not withstand a daylight attack, and that some would attempt to escape up the Little Bighorn Valley with their families, ponies, and other impedimenta. Custer likely wanted to intercept and drive them back towards the village. This idea, along with the possibility that the village might be strung out along the valley for several miles, probably influenced his decision to send Benteen's battalion to the left. Benteen's march was arduous, traversing rough, steep hills and deep valleys. The initial view from the point of battalion organization did not reveal the difficult terrain, but it became increasingly challenging as they advanced. To alleviate the strain, Lieutenant Gibson was sent ahead, but he saw no enemy and signaled the result of his reconnaissance to Benteen. The obstacles forced the battalion to the right, eventually bringing them within sight of the trail, about a mile distant. Many horses were greatly fatigued by the climbing and descending, with some falling far behind the column. Benteen wisely decided to follow the trail of the rest of the command, and they joined it just ahead of the pack train. During this march, they occasionally saw Custer's battalion, distinguished by the troop mounted on gray horses, marching at a rapid pace. They heard loud cheering and a few shots 2 or 3 times, but the cause of these demonstrations is unknown. After joining the trail, they came to a waterhole or morass, where a stream of running water originated. Benteen halted the battalion to water the horses. While watering, they heard firing in advance and grew impatient with the delay, starting off with his troop and taking the advance, although his place in the column was second. The rest of the battalion soon followed, catching up with Weir. They were now several miles from the Reno battlefield or the Little Bighorn. As they left the waterhole, the pack train arrived, and the thirsty mules plunged into the morass despite the packers' efforts to prevent them, as they had not had water since the previous evening. They passed a burning teepee, presumably fired by their scouts, containing the body of a warrior killed in the battle with Crook's troops on the Rosebud on June 17th. The battalions under Reno and Custer did not encounter any Indians until Reno arrived at the burning teepee, where a few were seen. These Indians did not appear surprised by the troops' appearance and made no effort to delay the column, instead keeping a safe distance to invite pursuit. Reno's command and scouts followed them closely until he received orders to move forward at a rapid gait and charge the village afterward, with the whole outfit supporting him. According to Reno's official report, this order was given near the burning teepee. He states that Lieutenant Cook, adjutant, informed him that the village was only 2 miles ahead and fleeing, and gave the aforementioned order. The Little Bighorn bottom, which the trail led through, is generally flat and 1 to 2 miles wide, with heavy timber along the stream, especially in the bends, obstructing the view of the main village until Reno reached his farthest advance. Reno followed the Indian trail, crossing at a ford, and then moved up the valley. Between this ford and a second one 3.5 miles below, a ridge parallels the river, rising abruptly from the valley. Reno's battalion moved at a trot to the river, where he delayed to water the horses and reform the column. He then sent word to Custer that he had the enemy in front of him and that they were strong. Custer had moved off to the right, separated from Reno by high bluffs and the river. Reno moved forward in column of 4s, then formed the battalion in line of battle across the valley, and later deployed as skirmishers. The hostiles fell back, firing occasionally, but made no decisive effort to check Reno's advance. However, when the horses of 2 men became unmanageable and carried them into the Indian camp, the Indians developed great force, opened a brisk fire, and made a dash toward the foothills on the left flank. The Re-scouts fled, abandoning the field. Reno realized he was being drawn into a trap, as the Indians were nearing their village and he could not see Custer or any other support. He decided to defend himself and give up the mounted attack, which he did. During the advance, the troops began to cheer in response to the whoops of the hostiles, prompting Reno to yell, "Stop that noise." As Reno did not see the whole outfit within supporting distance, he disobeyed his orders to charge the village and instead dismounted his command to fight on foot. The movements of the Indians around the left flank and the flight of the scouts caused the left to fall back, and the command became defensive in the timber, covered by the bank of the old riverbed. Reno's loss at this point was 1 wounded. The position was strong, protected in front by the bank and fringe of timber, somewhat open in the rear but sheltered by timber in the bottom. The duration of their stay in the bottom after being attacked in force is disputed, with some estimating a few minutes and others about an hour. While Reno remained there, his casualties were few. The hostiles had him nearly surrounded, with some firing from the rear of the position by Indians on the opposite bank of the river. After 1 man was killed close to Reno, he gave orders to mount and get to the bluffs, but this order was not generally heard or communicated. He countermanded the order, then repeated it, but again it was not widely understood. Individuals who observed the preparations of those near Reno informed their troop commanders, who then gave orders to mount. Due to the noise of the firing and their focused attention on the enemy, many did not know of the order until it was too late to accompany the command. Some remained concealed until the Indians left, then emerged. For others remained until night and escaped. Reno's command left the bottom in troop organizations in column, but in a straggling formation, with Reno leading the retreat. After exhausting his revolver shots, he threw them away. The hostile strength pushed Reno's retreat to the left, forcing them to find an alternative ford, where they struck the river at a fordable place. A pony trail led up a funnel-shaped ravine into the bluffs, where the command became jammed and lost all semblance of organization. The Indians fired into them, but not effectively, and there was no organized resistance during this retreat. The steep inclines men and horses climbed up under the excitement of danger were surprising. Lieutenant Donald McIntosh was killed shortly after departing the timber. Dr. DeWolf met his demise while ascending one of the bluffs, a short distance from the command. Lieutenant B.H. Hodgson's horse leaped from the bank into the river and fell dead, with the lieutenant suffering a leg wound, likely from the same bullet that killed the horse. Hodgson cried out, "For God's sake, don't abandon me." He was assured that he would not be left behind. Hodgson then grasped a comrade's stirrup strap and was taken across the stream, but soon after was shot and killed. Hodgson had previously stated that if he were dismounted or wounded in battle, he intended to take hold of somebody's stirrup to assist himself from the field. During the retreat, Private Dalvern of Troop F engaged in a hand-to-hand conflict with an Indian. His horse was killed, but he then shot the Indian, captured the Indian's pony, and rode to rejoin the command. Reno's casualties thus far were 3 officers, including Dr. J.M. DeWolf, and 29 enlisted men and scouts killed, 7 enlisted men wounded, and 1 officer, 1 interpreter, and 14 soldiers and scouts missing. Nearly all the casualties occurred during the retreat and after leaving the timber. Scout Charlie Reynolds and Isaiah Dorman, interpreter from Fort Rice, were killed in the timber on the right of Reno's second position. Bloody Knife was killed by Reno's side. The Re-Scouts continued their flight until they reached the supply camp at the mouth of the Powder on the 27th. The Crow Scouts remained with the command. Mr. F. Gerard, interpreter, informs me that it is his recollection that only 1 Crow Scout, Curley, and Mitch Bouillet, Crow interpreter, accompanied Custer's immediate command, and that all the other Crow Scouts were with Reno. Curley likely did not participate in the fight at all but left Custer just before the fighting commenced and went to the high ridge back of the Custer Ridge, watched the battle long enough to see that Custer would be defeated, and then made his way to the Bighorn River, where he waited for the arrival of the steamboat Far West, the smoke of which could undoubtedly be seen from a great distance. Not long after departing the waterhole, Sergeant Knipe of Troop C met us with an order from Custer to the commanding officer of the pack train to hasten its pace. The sergeant was sent back to the train with the message. As he passed the column, he exclaimed to the men, "We've got 'em, boys." From this and other remarks, we inferred that Custer had attacked and captured the village. Shortly afterward, we were met by Trumpeter Martin of Troop H, bearing a message signed by Colonel Cook, Adjutant, Benteen, "Come on, big village. Be quick. Bring packs," with the postscript, "Bring packs." A riderless horse was the only living thing in our front. Benteen inquired of the trumpeter what had transpired, and Martin informed him that the Indians had skedaddled, abandoning the village. The column had been marching at a trot and walk, according to the terrain's smoothness or brokenness. We now heard firing, initially straggling shots, which grew more pronounced as we advanced, appearing to come toward us. The column took the gallop with pistols drawn, expecting to meet the enemy we thought Custer was driving before him in his effort to communicate with the pack train, never suspecting that our forces had been defeated. As we formed in line to meet our supposed enemy, we came into full view of the Little Bighorn Valley. The valley was filled with horsemen riding to and fro in clouds of dust and smoke, as the Indians had set the grass ablaze to drive the troops out and cover their movements. On the bluffs to our right, we saw a body of troops engaged. An engagement also appeared to be occurring in the valley, but due to the distance, smoke, and dust, it was impossible to discern if those in the valley were friends or foes. A brief uncertainty arose regarding the direction we should take, but some Crow scouts passed by, driving a small herd of ponies, and one of them said, "Soldiers," and motioned for the command to go to the right. Following their directions, we soon joined Reno's battalion, which was still firing. Reno had lost his hat and had a handkerchief tied about his head, appearing very excited. Benteen's battalion was ordered to dismount and deploy as skirmishers on the edge of the bluffs overlooking the valley. Shortly after, the Indians withdrew from the attack. Lieutenant Hare approached me, grasping my hand heartily, and said with emphasis, "We've had a big fight in the bottom, got whipped, and I am glad to see you." I was satisfied he meant what he said, as I had already suspected something was amiss, but was not prepared for such startling information. I hope this first-hand account gives you a new perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos like this. I hope to bring you more first-hand accounts of different battles, so have a great day, and I'll see you next time.